Thank you all for being here. It's a red room with a mirrored ceiling. It's not such a bad place to be on a, Wednesday night. On a Wednesday night. Yeah. Derrick, let's begin in form. When I think about the nature of your paintings and how you make these paintings and how you combine, let's say, geometry and figuration, because it seems to me this is particular to you, but you're also calling back to carved African sculptures. You're calling back to Jacob Lawrence, to Romare Bearden. And I'm interested in how you've come to this, to the language that you work with.
Well, in the beginning of my career as an artist, starting graduate school at Columbia, I was more involved in sculpture and sculpture installation. And a lot of the works that I was using to make work, some made, some found, or some reclaimed, were tourist sculptures. I was really interested in like the crudeness of tourist sculptures and the way that they were not necessarily created in the same level of care or consideration in the way that they were formed, and also the concept behind the tourist sculptures, which was not really necessarily an African authentic object, but more designed for people who wanted to be reacquainted with the continent through an artifact.
Yeah, so when you talk about tourist sculptures, describe that.
I was beginning to use Maasai warrior sculptures that I started to collect at an import store in Harlem. And I started to collect them, in bulk. And I decided to have interventions with them. And so what I started doing, I started going to the Disney store and different kids stores and buying like Barbie and Ken's clothes and G.I. Joe clothes. And I started to dress them in these clothings because I felt that they were so alien from the original, for the idea of them being original, which they were not. I felt that they were really more geared towards Black Americans who had some interest in kind of be reacquainted with the continent in a very kind of like distant manner. And I also felt that they were a commodity or something that was a consumer object. And I thought that the Barbie and Ken's clothes at the time were very heavily influenced by the fashion of like urban culture. And it had a very distinctive impression that alluded to like contemporary culture and like logos and different things that were really prominent in the way that the toy manufacturer designed the clothing. And so I started putting them together. And when I did that, I really felt that they became more authentic in the rebirth of them.
Authentic to what?
To the way that images are created, or images are at least embodied with the idea of representation through ideologies that people form amongst each other as individuals or as groups, but they were tied to the commercial product and how the commercial product actually is the identity that we in contemporary culture have adopted as our original identity. And as a Black person and a Black American with like very fractured experiences with history, the fantasy of what was and what is became more exciting to me, because not knowing certain things allowed me to not be as literal in the depiction of things that I wanted to see in the world. And I felt very liberated to experiment with materials that embodied different components of what people expected things to exist as for them. And so it was fun because I knew that everything that I put together meant something, and it meant something to different people based on the juxtaposition of different things that embody other symbolic meanings for other people.
So how did that translate into paintings?
When I started to really get into that idea of making art like that, it just exploded. And I started making like so much stuff, and I didn't have enough space. I was making a lot of sculpture installations and making costumes and doing performances. And as a aspiring artist, it was very expensive to exist making installations and making video and making costumes and things like that. And although I was showing in a lot of different spaces and having opportunity, it was not necessarily benefiting me to keep reinvesting in this practice of making work. And what I was doing as I was making sculpture and making installations, I was also making drawings. And the drawings were things that I also used in installations that first started as a drawing, and then the drawings were translated to three-dimensional objects. And so I started to really think about my work, my drawings, as also part of the art, which I didn't necessarily think of before. I thought it was like preliminary things I was working on that helped people to get a better framing of what I was doing in the three-dimensional experience space. And then I realized when I moved into a smaller studio, I thought the challenge was now is to be able to create this same feeling of an experience, a three-dimensional experience, through something that was flat. And so collage became my main focus because I thought out of all the things that I was doing that was performative and sculptural and installation, collage had such a similarity because it had such an action to it, like putting things together, ripping things up, juxtaposing things. It was very physical. It required a lot of your wrist work, cutting things and, moving things around. And I thought that this is my performance, making collage. Like, this is my performance. The outcome is the artifact from me doing this. And then I began to really think about my work as operating in many different ways now, because now it was beyond the idea of just making a performance and installation, which I was doing simultaneously, but now this flat image started to have the same level of outcome and response from audience. And I felt like maybe, I was doing more than I should have been doing. But I also became smarter in my practice because I kept doing installation and performance and things like that. But it became more about being invited to do it in a space.
Can I ask you a question? There's so much that is contained within one of your paintings, so much vitality in there, so much dynamism. How much pleasure are you taking when you're painting one of these works?
Well, it's all fun. I believe, there's so many things happening in the world, especially, if you're Black and you have all these oppositional structures that are existing simultaneously all the time. My studio was considered like a safe haven and a sanctuary. And although there are very many different artists who choose to deal with the politics of society in a very direct way and responsive way in their work, and I do as well, but I also look at my space as a space of empowerment, perseverance, and just fun. And I think that, I remember when I was an undergrad, I had this class. It was called Art and Self, and it was about how you make art now and how you make art as a kid. And so that was an assignment that we all had to do in class. And so it was very difficult for some people to execute the assignment because they had to kind of reflect on their childhood experience and how art played a part of it. And for some people, it was very traumatic while they made art. But for me, it was like an escape. And it was a place of ownership and having dominance over the space that I occupied. And so I think about my studio in that same way, is that my studio becomes like another place that's separate from the society that I engage with outside of my studio. And so you have to be invited into my studio. And by being invited, that you have to be part of the vibe of my studio to be in. And there's different levels of coming into my studio. I have a front area that's where people just sit and talk. And then I have a back area where I work that most people are not invited.
Who gets to go to the back?
Well, my closest friend, Micheline Thomas, who's here. And, normally I don't have a lot of artists who come to the back. Usually it's a lot more my friends who are musicians or my friends who are writers or, people who I have more of a personal relationship with that understand my practice. And we don't necessarily talk about my work. We talk about other stuff. My work just happens to be in the background of our conversation. But normally, after I finish working in the studio, my back of my studio becomes closed off, and I'm kind of pretty much operating in the front of my studio, listening to music, hanging out with my friends, just kind of like switching the way I'm thinking, the way I'm communicating, and not really, because I think that my art is really for me first, and I really enjoy making it. And the way that the paintings come to life is slowly I put one image in, usually a singular image, and then I start with that, and then I come back and add another image around that image and another image, and to create a world around that image. And I rarely do the whole thing at the same time. I usually start with one thing and kind of build the visual language from there. So it takes time. As I'm working on things, I don't like to have like input, because I think that the way that I make work is very like a stream of consciousness. And I think that you can't become an interesting person. You have to be an interesting person. And I think that, I think you can try to be interesting, but if you're interesting, you're just interesting. And I I know a lot of people who are really interesting who may not even think that they're interesting. And those are the people that I think I try to surround myself with, because I feed off of them. And there might be people that no one else want to be around, but I think that they're interesting sometimes. And I think that kind of influences my work, decision around my work. What they think about the work sometimes means more to me than someone who may be more important in society, you know?
So we're here, we're talking because Situation Comedy opens
Yeah.
tomorrow. So generally speaking, people won't have had a chance to see that, but we've got the work circulating on over here on the screen. Wanted to, maybe let's just kind of unpack one of the pieces and situate what you've been describing within a work. Maybe let's go to the Tootsie Roll. Or do you want?
Let's go to this one.
Okay, fine. Let's pause. Let's pause on this one.
Yeah.
Okay, let's
Yeah.
interested in talk.
Yeah.
What we're seeing.
So with this particular painting, it kind of started first through my familiarity with the object that is being poured into, which are depictions of these very important American artifacts called face vessels. And they started to emerge in Americas around the early 1800s. And they were created by, enslaved Africans as a place marker for warding off evil spells. So people who, couldn't read or write or spell, they would create these face vessels, and they would put them on the head of the graves of people who died. And the whole idea is that the more exaggerated the face was, the better it was to ward off evil spirits. So they became a very popular object in the South, and then white Southerners make them mostly now, and they started making them in the mid-1800s, and they're pretty much associated with the deep South of America, but they were first made as these kind of like ceremonial things that people collected and used as kind of like, I guess, religious or spiritual things. And so one of my family members collects them, and he has a lot of them on his mantle at home, and he lent them to the museum, to the Met for the recent show.
Oh, for the Dave the Potter show. And
He has like a lot of Dave vessels, and he collects a lot of historical artifacts. And so I got to spend a lot of time with it, and I was like, this is just on your mantle. Like, this should be, and like this could just break. Like, this thing is from the early 1800s, and it's not necessarily considered. And a lot of these artifacts are not considered the same level of artifact as some other objects that may be as old in the world. Again, all of these things are not based on like being angry that they're not. Like, I'm glad that I'm able to touch it and be around it. So for me, it's like, this is a connection that I have access to. And so it became, I was just thinking about it, how important it was and how significant it was. And the situation comedy idea came out of the structure of TV and how situation comedies even exist. They are kind of created to have some level of awareness of social discourse or social criticism that is usually two different parties are in disagreement in the beginning of the episode. And then the whole part of the situation comedy is that they resolve their conflict and then they're happy at the end. And that's usually how situation comedies exist. And I think that's how Black people live in America. I think that we have to negotiate trauma in a very particular way all the time. And we have to exist in a space where we have to resolve our own issues amongst each other and then go back into society that may not necessarily embrace the ideologies that we believe are important to exist. So I believe that we live in an idea that's very much driven by situation comedy, and that's the reason why a lot of lead characters in situation comedies that existed in America. I don't really know that much about situation comedies here in London, but they've been really successful because they allow, and they're not always black writers who write for these characters, but they allow to speak about certain important things that they could not say on a news station because it has this other element of laughter that happens after it to kind of dismantle the seriousness of what they just said. And that's what situation comedies are structured in that way. And so that became something that I thought about after I made the work, because I usually make things that have some serious things dropped in them and some funny things dropped in them. And sometimes when I look at them, I wonder, like, why did you make this? Or like, what's going on in your head, man? Like, like I think like that when I'm in my studio, like, what? You're messed up. Like, like that. But it's really thinking about like how to negotiate and move forward in society in a way that you still feel some level of ownership, self actualization in some ways, and accountability for, things that you do know, things that you can change, things that you can be a part of. And so this particular piece, it's called Sweetening the Pot. Sometimes in my studio, I'm like, I take a chair at a certain time and I'll sit in my chair in front of each piece for like 20 minutes with like a drink in my hand, listen to music. And I'm like, what is this piece about? What are you saying, Derrick? What's going on with you, man? I think about all the different things that, are in the work. I'm like, okay, so why is this here with this, with that?
So why the Kool-Aid jug?
Well, I think that the way that things are structured, and I was listening to a Nikki Giovanni album lately, her first album. I was listening to that a lot. It's on repeat. And the way that, because my work has always been interested in like consumerism and cultural identity in relation to certain things like that, is like the trauma of society as it relates to black people is so embedded into the core of every society that it's almost like if you take it apart, everything will just fall apart. Like it's like part of the fabric of the society. So like, when you're drinking Kool-Aid or you're drinking something that's fun and you know that your family has been drinking it for a long time and you know that you like a lot of sugar in it, and then you learn where sugar came from and how the people that died from the sugar, you're not going to stop drinking sugar. You know what I'm saying? You're not going to like stop eating sugar altogether. So you have to like fix your mind as a black person, like this is a traumatic product, but I'm drinking it. As I'm saying, that's how we live. We live where we've learned trauma or things that we are partaking in has come from a very traumatic experience. And then we think like, but I do like sugar. I can't give up sugar. I've been eating sugar all my life. So like giving up sugar would be such a radical thing to do, and then you become diabetic. And also, you just become consumed with the idea of pleasure, because pleasure is part of the idea of like forgetting about traumatic experience, because it's substituted for a level of instant pleasure. And so that's what I thought about when I was making the work. And I wasn't thinking about all the politics of it when I was making the work. I just thought that the faces on the pots were so funny and bizarre. And I said to myself, what other commercial product I think is as really menacing and interesting that we accept without questioning? And I thought about the Kool-Aid pitcher. And I thought that, these relationships, the Kool-Aid pitcher is kind of like the facilitator of what is from the sugar to what goes into the pot. And then, it's usually like the red flavor, which is the worst dye you can have, but is the most colorful and more provocative color. And so I thought about those things as an artist. I thought about like form, color, visual iconography, those things. And then I also want people to look at the work the way that contemporary culture exists. You don't have to know all that. I know it, and I think it's important for people who want to know it. But I think that I would love to also enjoy a response to my work based on just the conceptual framework, the formal aspects of it, the thought that's put into the way that I treated the fabric, the way that I treated the compositional elements of color, that's what I focus on the most when I'm in my studio. The story behind everything is just things that I think if you are a person, again, who's reading, who's engaging with different people, is going to be in your work already. You don't have to make it in your work. It's going to be in your work. You can't remove it. It's like removing your brain from your body. Like it seeps into your work. So you have to purposely not do it. You have to purposely make a conscious effort to not say stuff if you are a person who is educated. you know?
I mean, break that down a bit more, because I think that's interesting. When you talk about you have to purposely not talk about something, as it were, it's not that this isn't present
Yes.
in the work,
Yeah.
but what's the strategy? Are you trying to direct people's gaze in a different direction? Like,
I just think that some people get it and some people just don't get it. And I think that it's okay, to look at work, artists. Like for a black person, our whole existence is to look at art that we are not personally interested in, to be tested on it, to fail if we don't write the right things on it, to act like we care about something that is considered the most important thing in art, to look at things that do not mirror you, and to write thesis on it, to work in a museum that occupies only that. So that's something that we do. And I think that as an artist, as a black person, I also have made peace with the idea that I can make things that I don't necessarily feel that I have to explain, and that people who may not necessarily get what the motivation of making it, who may enjoy just the formal elements of it, can enjoy it equally and feel comfortable having it and enjoying it as an artifact, because it now is an artifact once it leaves my studio. And I'm more concerned with people preserving it than understanding what it is. Like, I want to make sure it's in the right temperature, that that you're going to have it in the right storage, that you'll be able to loan it to a museum if they need it. To me, that's my main concern once it leaves my studio, because in my studio, all the ideas are being worked out. And once it's worked out on this thing, is more concerned with people getting what it was about. And actually, my cousin, who I talked to yesterday, he said, "Do people even know what that thing is in the painting? Are you going to tell them?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "You should tell them." I said, "I don't know if I got to tell them." So AC said, he's like, "I told him, so I'm going to tell him I told you guys." But normally I would not. Normally, one of the things that has been kind of like a thorn in my side as an artist is that I've made work that has a very ambiguous nature, and that people see it and they see different things. And because it has this idea that makes people feel good when they see it, that it's usually dismissed because it's not answering all the questions that they believe I should answer as a black artist living in a particular way. And because I don't say, like, this is that, look at that, over here is this, that is that, I didn't learn to look at art like that. I learned to look at art and learn about the artist through research and investment. I didn't learn about the artist I like the first time I saw the work. Like, they didn't give me a list to tell me everything that was in the Picasso painting or tell me everything that was in the painting, like a checklist. I had to like research it and talk to historians, and I want people to do the same for me.
I mean, there's, sometimes sometimes your work gets, described with kind of language of black joy.
Yeah, and happiness.
Yeah, exactly. That always seems to me to be undervaluing the depth in the work.
Yes.
Like, it feels there's more.
Yeah.
The surface, as you say, is one thing, and it's a valuable thing. But actually, can you get to the joy without also an awareness somewhere of the tension, of the trauma, of the history? I mean, I know we've been talking about that, but I
think the joy is something that some people need. If you were to say a different experience that people have, like, for instance, if you're in a museum and you are a black person going to see a show, most of the time, if you see a black artist in a museum, their place in the museum is to acknowledge and to present ideas of trauma or some traumatic history. And then you walk into the Monet room and it's like beautiful abstract flowers. And so black people overall have never had the leisure of walking into a museum and having the same, like, I'm going to have lunch, I'm going to look at the floral paintings, I'm going to go have a coffee and tea downstairs, then I'm going to meet my friend. You don't have that. You you leave out like heavy, like, like, what's going on? Then you also, like, this experience that people, artists decide to talk about becomes like this kind of mirror reflection of, like, this is what happens to everybody. And people who are there think of those experiences as very singular, operating for the multitude of people. I think we don't get the pleasure of going to a museum to have a leisurely day.
So
We rarely get to have that moment of like looking at the formal aspect of it. When we're in school and we're as students, when we're looking at art that we necessarily do not necessarily connect with, we have to look at the formal aspect of what it is. We have to look at the frame, we look at the glazes, we look at the treatment of the material. We get to do that. But when we as artists are put, and as artists like me making work out in the world, they're just not getting a chance to show their work because their work is not acknowledging things that other people think we should be talking about and not giving us the freedom to talk about things that we want to talk about first.
So leisure is liberation, leisure is a politics.
It's the three-dimensionality of, of anyone, the complexity of humanity, and no one could really exist without having components of like reset. And leisure is just reset. And leisure just is not like a whimsical fun thing. It could be, but it means that you are no longer performing for someone outside of your community. It means that you are in your own space with your door closed and you are operating as if you are the center of the universe at this time. And if you're able to do that in your studio, those things can leave your studio and give people a better glimpse of Black life beyond the opposing ideas of what they may think we're thinking about. Because we don't think about like what other people think about us most of the time. We don't think about like, it's an illusion that we are existing in this opposing reality of like what this person think about us, what this person feel. That's what it seems when you think about what is the loop of media and the loop of things. I think we're trying to renegotiate and reaffirm things that we have learned and understood. And now that we have access to media and access to information, we're way more aware and informed about histories and things that we are sharing with each other. So it's not like I'm making art that I don't want other people to have. I'm making art that a lot of people can have, but I'm making art that will somewhat fill in blanks that I feel are existing in practices that are being put out in the world that are representing Black culture.
A question: is the sky always sunny in your paintings, or are there clouds?
I mean, I think there's versions of blues. I think a sky always has a tint of blue in it, and I think that if I'm talking about nighttime and when I'm talking about the sunset or sunrise, I'm more interested in the variations of blue in the sky, and I think that certain blues can represent the same level of darkness as Black if you know how to do it. And I think that when you look at a lot of artists that are housed in many museums, the idea of transforming the viewer's experience or their experience with your work is understanding that we know that the sky exists even in fantasy as blue. And when it changes tone, we also are aware of the drastic change based on the artist's interpretation and also our awareness of the color. But I think that color exists in our minds. It's always based on the reference, which is usually blue. So bringing blue to blue-black or blue to light blue, I think that blue is always something that if it's not there, we see it.
There's an interesting quote I feel you made talking about your work, the kind of brands that arrive in there, Kool-Aid, Tootsie Rolls, Telfar Clemens.
Yeah.
You talked at one point about this is a conversation about being a Black consumer and about being consumed, which I thought was such a telling way of thinking about this.
I mean, I think we're all consumers, but I would not try to dictate or interpret how another race or person consumes. I just know that for people who have been considered marginalized or disinvested, the idea of consumerism relates to like this idea of being part of a thriving culture, being able to participate in the thriving culture, being able to buy things. That's why there's different levels of like high-end things to really low-end things. It gives any person, a citizen, an immigrant, a sense of empowerment because they have an idea of choice. They chose to buy this thing based on how much money they have in their hand, and that gives you a certain sense of like being part of that the cultural group of that city or that country or whatever. So I think consumerism is something that is here to stay. I don't think that it's ever going to not exist, but I think that understanding the ideology and the mechanism in which it's attached to when it deals to cultural representation is something that most people do not understand.
What's it like being you walking down the street? Because it seems to me that you are seeing so much and making so many connections. Everything you've described here has a really, extraordinary depth to the way you're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, when I like, for instance, a series that I made called Style Variations is, I live in Bed-Stuy. I'm originally from Baltimore, but I've lived in New York since '93, and I started to notice, like most people notice when you live in certain neighborhoods, you see based on the economic structure of the neighborhood, how things are more exposed. Like in neighborhoods that are black, you can see people getting their hair done from the beginning to the end. You can see whatever is the most when you walk past a beauty supply store, you can see whatever is the hot product that they want people to buy. It's a thoroughfare of exposure of cultural importance. But what people don't know is that there's a lot of influence of what is being consumed based on the observation of the manufacturer and the owner looking out in the street and seeing how people are creating things without them. And so the goal is, how can I get them to stop doing things on their own and buy my thing? So what people are doing in the street becomes the influence for products being made, and then those products end up in the store. And the whole idea is convincing the people who are making the things. Like how many, like the idea of restaurants, for instance. If you're in a neighborhood that's Caribbean, I mean, you really don't need a Caribbean restaurant. My super told me one time when we were saying that we asked him, do we know about this soul food restaurant down the street? And he said, my soul food place is downstairs in my house. Like the idea of like wanting something outside of what you have is really thinking about the idea of like leisure, thinking about convenience, thinking about the idea to be able to go buy food is also something when you know something you can make. So all those things to me are so important, but it also becomes an influence with my work because I know that I can have this experience as a viewer, as a student, to learn about these things that are happening around me, and I can bring it into my studio and really dissect it in a way that I think I can learn from it. And then sometimes I extract certain things and highlight them, blow them up, or exaggerate them because I want people to see, like, this is what your work inspired me to do. Sometimes I even go to the fabric stores because a lot of collage stuff I use is from the neighborhood fabric stores. And sometimes I'll go back and I'll open up my phone and say, I made this painting from this fabric I bought here. And they're like, really? I'm like, yeah, this is, I got this fabric from here and I made this painting and I used the fabric that's over there to make this thing. And it makes them feel differently about what they're doing because they know it's not just an idea of supplying things, but it's being transformed into different things that are not necessarily things they're thinking about. And I like to do that. I like to take things that are from my neighborhood and transform them or incorporate them in the works that I'm making and put them in spaces that are museums or galleries or places that people can really, because you learn in a gallery museum to inspect, to take it seriously, to look at it like hard. And when you're walking down the street, you don't look at those things the same way. But if you move them into a gallery space, they have a certain level of importance that people start to really think like, is this, how do you make this? Where is this from? They start to question all these things, and it directs back to the source, which is usually the people that I'm inspired by when I make things.
Can we talk about the social aspect to your practice as well? Because as well as making paintings, as well as being in the studio, you also have a residency project, The Last Resort, which is can you talk about that for a moment? Because I think it's an important part of what you do.
Yeah. Like when people start talking about my work when it relates to leisure and like Black joy was a thing that people started talking about my work because I was just making these works. I just wanted to make the works I wanted to see. I did not see figures that I thought were interesting enough to be on floaties that I wanted to see them on. I just started making these figures on floaties, and it kind of came out again. Like the thing is about going to like, Ivy League schools like Columbia or Pratt, whatever. When you learn all that stuff, you cannot unlearn it. It seeps into your psyche of what you make and how you make it, and you just got to really deal with the reality of being indoctrinated into something and how to kind of take ownership of that experience and reformat it into something that's yours. And so the floaties came out of looking at paintings of people resting on chaise lounges. And I didn't want to do that because I thought it was important to have those images presented, but my friend Micheline was already doing that, so I couldn't do that. So I said, okay, now what am I gonna do? What am I gonna do that's Derrick, that relates to my personality, my humor, things that I like to do in my work? And so I thought about the floaty. I was like, the floaty could operate in the same way, in a very, in a very contemporary sense that people kind of can relate to. And I started making portraits of figures, black figures, resting on these flotation objects. Although the concept was really about the flotation thing, the figures are very angular most of the time. They're made with like very straight lines, and they mimic what I believe the African sculpture that I was drawing in 2000. But the floaties and the other things that I make in my work have more of an organic, more rounded feel that operates around these kind of rigid structures. And that kind of became my interest. In 2019, during the pandemic, I acquired some property in my hometown in Baltimore, my home city. I bought it just to have a place when I go visit my family. I was kind of wanted to relax, come from New York. And then the house, was a really big property with a lot of green space around it. And I said to myself, this is too good to keep to myself. I was like, this is too nice. I was like, I have to bring other people here to see how great this space is. I had to bring other artists there, and I had to, and being from Baltimore, I understand the kind of the social, political, racial structure of the city, and I thought it would be really interesting to really focus on leisure and social engagement as a form of the motivation of the space. Even though we have studios and stuff there, I basically they want people to work. Yeah.
So it's a residency program without an obligation to
Yeah.
produce anything out of it.
Yeah. And most artists think that they're going to do stuff when they get there, but when they get there, they realize, I'm not going to do anything. And it feels great. They feel bad at first. I think a lot of artists feel bad when they come to a residency, they don't want to work, but they usually at the end of like 1 week of being there, they'll say, I don't want to work. And they say it as like they feel guilty. And I'm like, good, because I don't want you to leave anything here, because I don't want to have to store nothing that you want to leave behind, because it's what artists do too. They leave stuff, you got to mail it to them and all that. I was like, don't leave anything that you can't take with you. Don't make anything. If you make something, make some drawings you can roll up, you can take with you. We don't really have storage space here, but we also want you not to make work because you feel compelled to do it. Yeah, that's one of the reasons. So we have like dinners. It's not just for artists, for writers, visual artists, musicians, people who come in town, they stay there. Like the focus primarily, it was designed primarily for black creatives to come and exist. But we also have allies who come. There are people who pop by who are not black, who stay at the house. We have parties, we have food, we have chefs who come, local chefs come and make food. It's really fun. We have like lectures. We just had a really great writer who wrote a book on De La Soul and the first book on Kendrick Lamar. Marcus Moore came last week and did like a whole presentation about his book. So we have people come all the time and hang out. They bring people. It's like, for me, it's really fun because in Baltimore, I became the center of the creative community coming home, and I wanted to shift it off of my focus on me. And I thought the only way to really do that is to create a space that's for everybody. And so I would no longer be the head of the table, but I would just be a part of the engagement. And I think that what I did with the space kind of enabled me to be like more like part of the party and not the host of the party.
And I think that's a perfect note, life, death, and human connection, to finish on. Derrick Adams, thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.